Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. This podcast is brought to you by Magellan TV, a new kind of streaming service that aims to bring you the best documentaries from around the world. On today's episode, the History Guy talks about two impressive Kates of the 19th century. First is Kate Warne, who became America's first female detective when she was hired by Alan Pinkerton in 1856. She may have even saved Abraham Lincoln's life. Then the History Guy talks about one of the women behind one of the most famous gunslingers of the West, Big Nose Kate, the common-law wife of Doc Holliday. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
In 1856, 23-year-old Kate Warne entered the offices of the Pinkerton Detective Agency seeking employment. But the agency didn't need any more secretaries. Well, she wasn't there to be a secretary. She was responding to an ad that was seeking detectives. Pinkerton explained to her it is not the custom to employ women detectives, but she calmly laid out her case that women would be most useful in worming out secrets in many places that would be impossible for men. She convinced him, and he hired her, and she went on to have a career with the Pinkerton Agency, solving crimes, helping the Union during the Civil War, and at one point, possibly, saving the life of Abraham Lincoln. The story of Kate Warne, considered by many to be America's first female detective, is history that deserves to be remembered. Little is known about Kate's early life. She was born in 1833 in Erin, New York, but who her family was or what she did up until 1856 is poorly documented. She said she was a widow when she came to apply for the Pinkerton job. There are no positively identified photos of Miss Warne, but Alan described her in his memoirs and in some official Pinkerton documents. She was, he said, a commanding person with clear-cut features, slender and brown-haired. Her features were decidedly of an intellectual cast. Her face was honest, which would cause one in distress instinctively to select her as a confidant. Perhaps it was this quality that convinced Alan Pinkerton to hire her over his brother Robert's objections. Pinkerton had founded his detective agency in 1850 with a business partner, in part as a response to the need for railway companies to hire outside detectives to solve robberies and embezzlement. Pinkerton had been appointed the first detective in Chicago a year earlier. Pinkerton was born in Scotland in 1819 and came to America with his wife in 1842. He was a staunch abolitionist, and as early as 1844 his cabin in Dundee, Illinois, was part of the Underground Railroad. When she was hired in 1856, Kate was presumably the first female detective in America, and Pinkerton was not so foolish as to not use her. Many of the records of her exploits were lost when there was a fire in the Pinkerton office in Chicago in 1871, but enough remains to illuminate some exciting episodes in her life. In 1858, Kate's services were brought into a case investigating embezzlement in the Adams Express Company. The prime suspect in the case was one Mr. Maroney, who had stolen $50,000 from the company, but the detectives couldn't get enough proof. Kate brought a new angle to the case and befriended Mr. Maroney's wife. In short order, she got the evidence they needed and recovered nearly 80% of the stolen money. By 1860, Kate had so proven herself that Pinkerton placed her in charge of his newly founded Female Detective Bureau. The women in the Pinkerton agency put themselves at risk as much as the men, changing accents, clothes, and risking their lives in pursuit of their objectives. Called Pinks, many of them would assist the Union during the Civil War. Possibly Kate's greatest success came a year later, for her part in investigating the Baltimore plot. In 1861, the Pinkerton Agency was hired by the president of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad to investigate rumors in Baltimore that secessionists were planning on sabotaging railroads after Lincoln's election. Pinkerton dispatched numerous detectives, including Warne and another female detective, Hattie Lawton. Lincoln's election had already caused significant disruption to the Union. South Carolina had seceded in December of 1860, and 6 more states would secede before Lincoln was inaugurated. Maryland was in a particularly complex situation. It was a border state, one that permitted slavery but had strong pro-Union sentiments as well. Its nearness to Virginia and strong pro-secessionist ties made it a possibly dangerous state for Lincoln to pass through. In February, Lincoln began a 70-city tour from Illinois to Washington, D.C. that would end with his inauguration on March 4th. Pinkerton's spies, including and especially Kate Warne, had discovered evidence of a plot much larger than the one the railroad president had initially suspected. Dissidents in Baltimore, they believed, were planning on assassinating the president-elect. Kate had been working in Baltimore undercover, using the names Mrs. Cherry and Mrs. M. Barley. Posing as a Southern belle from Montgomery, Alabama, where she'd stayed during the Adams Express Company investigation, she was tasked with cultivating the wives and daughters of suspected plotters. She socialized with high-class secessional circles at parties, wearing a black and white brocade on her breast, which was briefly a symbol of secession. Her infiltration of these societies put together vital evidence of the plot to Pinkerton, though he maintained that his other agents uncovered evidence as well. She heard during her investigations that there was a plot to kill Lincoln when he was forced to change trains in Baltimore. Because of different gauges, it was necessary to switch tracks to board a southbound train to D.C., which would require a carriage ride of about a mile. According to Pinkerton records, Lincoln was to be waylaid as he exited the train to get to his carriage. A row or fight was to be got up by some outsiders, to quell which the few policemen at the depot would rush out, thus leaving Mr. Lincoln entirely unprotected at the mercy of a mob of secessionists. Once he was killed, the conspirators had chartered a boat that was ready to carry them to Virginia. Pinkerton would write in his memoir, A Spy of the Rebellion, that he had met with Cipriano Ferrandini, a Baltimore hairdresser who was the accused leader of the plot. Pinkerton said he met with Ferrandini and several other conspirators at a hotel in Baltimore. When asked, "Are there no other means of saving the South except by assassination?" Ferrandini said, "No, he must die, and die he shall, and if necessary, we will die together." Now aware of the plot, Pinkerton rushed to deliver the news to Lincoln, desperate to save his life. On February 21st, Lincoln met with Pinkerton and an associate. Lincoln was unconvinced that such a plot existed, though he agreed that if it did, it should be taken seriously. Lincoln only agreed to take precautions when his designated Secretary of State, William Seward, reported independently a threat of assassination reported by his son Frederick Seward. But Lincoln, taking seriously his role of steady hand, refused to adjust any of his plans for Harrisburg and stopped before passing through Baltimore. There was some disagreement over how to best protect the president. Lincoln's self-appointed bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamon, butted heads with Pinkerton. Lamon suggested that he would give the president-elect a revolver and a bowie knife, but Pinkerton insisted that he would not for the world have it said that Mr. Lincoln had to enter the national capital armed. Despite disagreements, the plan was put together in time to avoid the plot. Lincoln only deviated from his original schedule beginning at 5:45 on the evening of February 22nd, when he left a scheduled and high-profile dinner. Leaving the building, he put on a traveling suit and a soft cap, carried a shawl so he could play the role of an invalid and remain unrecognized. Pinkerton had telegraph lines between Harrisburg and Baltimore cut to prevent any information from getting ahead of them. Lincoln, with Lamon and Pinkerton, met Warne at the train station. She had secured the seats on the train with a cover story that they were for her sick brother and family members. During the night of February 22nd to 23rd, Kate Warne stayed in the car adjacent to Lincoln's and supposedly remained vigilant and awake the entire night. Some stories suggest that this was the inspiration for the Pinkertons' famous tagline, "We never sleep." The train arrived in Baltimore around 3:30 a.m. The cars were secretly shifted to a new train, and Kate remained in Baltimore while Lincoln was taken safely to D.C. His family had remained on the original train, but the crowd that gathered at the station to meet the president the following afternoon were disappointed. Mary Todd and the children had stepped off the train a few blocks short of the station. Later study has brought the entire concept of the Baltimore plot into question. Ward Hill Lamon would argue years later that it is perfectly manifest that there was no conspiracy of 100 or 50, of 20, of 3, no definite purpose in the heart of even one man to murder Mr. Lincoln in Baltimore. Some historians take Pinkerton's actions as a case of overcaution that he would display in overestimating Confederate forces when he worked under George McClellan during the Civil War. No one was ever indicted for the plot or for planning it, though a number of people were jailed without habeas corpus under suspicion. Cipriano Ferrandini, the supposed plotter, was not tried for the crime, although he would admit to planning to help attack Northern volunteers who passed through Baltimore, as happened during the Baltimore riot in 1861. Lincoln would later regret making the arrangements to sneak through the city, as he was lampooned in the press for cowardice throughout his presidency. Kate's role in the investigation and the solution was critical. Not only did she provide indispensable information that helped to uncover the potential plot, but she helped carry that information to Lincoln, helped to set up the secret trip, accompanied on the trip, protected him on that trip. If there was in fact a plot, she was central to its thwarting. In any case, she proved herself to be an able spy, able to infiltrate target groups and to accomplish her objectives undercover. Only 9 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, Alan Pinkerton sent a message to Lincoln offering his services. Before Lincoln could respond, however, Pinkerton was contacted by George McClellan, recently made Major General of Ohio Volunteers. Pinkerton and McClellan had crossed paths during Pinkerton's work with various railroad companies. Pinkerton, along with Warne and several other agencies, set up their headquarters in Cincinnati, beginning a military counterintelligence agency that would serve as a prototype for all kinds of agencies, and in part as a direct predecessor to the Secret Service, which was originally created to suppress rampant counterfeiting. During the war, Kate often traveled with Pinkerton on missions, occasionally posing as his wife while they infiltrated Southern social circles in Tennessee and Kentucky. Kate went under various aliases, often different versions of her own name, such as Kay or Kitty, Warren. Alan's brother Robert disliked the whole ordeal, often arguing with Warren when she turned in her expenses. Robert felt that he was supporting a sordid affair between his brother and Kate, besides the fact that he didn't think that women should be detectives at all. While Kate traveled often and worked closely with Alan Pinkerton, it isn't certain that they ever had a romantic relationship. Pinkerton's work under McClellan has been blamed for the general's timidity during his command. While Pinkerton successfully identified all of the regiments under Lee's command, he also consistently overestimated the size of the Confederate forces they faced. Some of the reports later had their force estimates exaggerated even more, apparently because of McClellan himself. Whoever's fault it was, Pinkerton often butted heads with Lafayette Baker, who was leading a counterintelligence group for Winfield Scott, commanding general of the U.S. Army. Both Baker and Pinkerton would claim to hold the office of Chief of the United States Secret Service. While it isn't clear just what missions Warren participated in during the war, she was certainly involved in important work reporting on the enemy, and it wasn't without peril. Timothy Webster, another one of Pinkerton's agents, was hanged in Richmond in 1862. That Pinkerton's direct work for the war effort ended when McClellan was removed from command of the Army of the Potomac after the Battle of Antietam. After the Civil War, Kate continued to work with the agency to solve crimes. She helped solve the murder of a bank teller who had been killed by a colleague who had stolen $130,000. Pinkerton suspected Alexander Drysdale, but he couldn't prove it. Kate went undercover as Mrs. Potter, and through Drysdale's wife, discovered where Drysdale had hid the money. In a later case, she went undercover as a fortune teller named Lucille to get information, all while supervising the other female agents. Almost certainly she solved many more cases and did more for the country than we now know, with so many of the records destroyed. She may have continued to do so for years, but she grew sick on New Year's Day, 1868, and died a few days later. Alan Pinkerton was by her side, and he had her buried in his family plot in Chicago, where several other Pinkerton agents are also buried. Headstone says she died of congestion of the lungs. Pinkerton called Kate one of his best 5 spies, and specifically thanked her and Timothy Webster in his book, The Spy of the Rebellion. When Robert tried to end the practice of hiring women in 1876, Alan sent him a blistering telegram. It has been my principle to use females for the detection of crime where it has been useful and necessary. I can trace it back to the time that I first hired Kate Warne, up to the present time, and I intend to still use females whenever it can be done judiciously. I must do it, or falsify my theory, practice, and truth. When he died in 1884, his sons quickly dismantled the Female Detective Bureau. They would later lead the agency into controversy, change its reputation by siding with companies against labor unions, leading to the Anti-Pinkerton Act of 1893, which still stands and reads that no employee of the Pinkerton Detective Agency or similar agency shall be employed in any government service. In a time when women had few opportunities for paid employment, Kate Warne became America's first detective 35 years before women were allowed to become police officers. She used that opportunity to never waver from her profession, to never shy away from danger. It's a tragedy that we know so little about what she did because of the loss of the records, but in some way it's fitting that for a secret agent, much of her career remains shrouded in mystery. When Alan Pinkerton would interview prospective female detectives, he would say this to them: "In my service, you will serve your country better than on the field. I have several female operatives. If you choose to come on board, you will train with the head of my female detectives, Kate Warne. She has never let me down."
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. A took some real guts for a 23-year-old woman in 1856 to show up to take a detective job. And not even just that, but not just like any detective job, but with the Pinkertons, who were already a reasonably big deal in 1856. It makes me think that she must have been quite a person to know. And it really makes me wonder, one of the things that you talked about somewhat in this episode is the fact that we know so little about what she actually did. And it makes you really wonder what else, what other kind of adventures and things like that she must have done that we just don't know anything about today.
Yeah, and honestly, that could go both ways. I mean, in that what we know about her came from Pinkerton's books, and Pinkerton might have been embellishing in his book. So her life might have been more exciting, and we just have no idea. Or her life might have actually been less exciting than was presented. We don't, like any other historical figure, we only have what we have, and especially for lesser known or forgotten history, then there wasn't a whole lot recorded at the time. But I suspect she was just an extraordinary person because she was taking extraordinary risks. Yeah. But on the other hand, I think that's probably typical in that I would imagine that there are a lot of, especially women, who had much more significant contributions, and those contributions weren't well recorded. And so there's probably a lot of them out there that had more exciting lives than we realize, and she's an example of that. I certainly would love to have met her and see what she said, because we don't even have a verified photograph of her. The one painting is a drawing, and there is one photograph where there's a cavalryman or someone in a cavalry jerkin behind Pinkerton, and they think that actually might be Kate Warne, but they're not sure. And so it's interesting. Though we don't even know for sure, what she looks like, and we only really have the story told by her boss, who had reasons to tell it the way he told it, and so we're you can only get this sense that this is really an extraordinary personality at a time when that's just not how women were expected to behave.
Yeah, and it is interesting to think about what what Pinkerton might have said. He was an interesting figure, and I would say that he was not perfect. That's what I'll say about Alan Pinkerton. He was not perfect, but this was kind of an interesting part of his legacy, is that he really defended wanting women and the Pinks in detective work, and it seemed like that was something that was very important to him. I mean, he fought his brother on it. That he really
he's fighting his own agency on the idea. And I think it's hard to say if he was just practically realizing that this was an untapped source that could be very powerful, or if he was that was a cause ahead of time. It's kind of hard to say.
Or if he was, trying to. It's hard to see with in terms of if he was being progressive, if he was trying to make that a part of his story, so that people would look at that. I don't know. It's really hard to know. But I do wonder, not just Kate Warne is actually, in some ways, one of the female detectives we know more about, because there are a number of, there were a number of them working for Alan Pinkerton. We know almost nothing about him at all.
Yeah, we don't even know their names.
Yeah, so it's interesting that Kate seems to have done a wonderful job, and Alan Pinkerton seemed to think very, very highly of her. You mentioned at the end of it where he says that she never let me down, and she must have been quite good at what she did. The Pinkertons were pretty good at what they were doing. They were well known.
Yeah, they're the top in the world of what they were doing.
Yeah, and it's
unscrupulous sometimes doing so. When you talk about it, but I think she must have been an extraordinary person, and I think it's that we only have sort of an echo of what that whole person was like, and the story that needs to be told.
Yeah. And you wonder how many stories there are that are like that, and how representative she is of a lot of people who didn't get to have anything written down about them.
They'd get their stories told. Yeah. Well, especially and setting aside everything else. They're detectives. There's reasons that they keep certain of the things that they were doing secret, and so to that extent, she probably was a secretive person, and probably had to be. And that's part of why we don't get to know her.
Yeah, and that could speak to how good she was at doing what she did. It's too bad that there isn't some kind of, she didn't write a memoir or something afterward, but it's where you are. And it's just that you, like you said, we have what we have from history. And I think one of the cool things that we really like to do on the History Guy is find those stories and take what we do have and find the story in there, because there are so many things that were so exciting, were life and death situations that have essentially been completely forgotten, and that's ignoring even some of the stuff we talk about that was just mostly forgotten. There's stuff that, you find just a few articles about in the old newspapers that we've made stories out of.
And historians will come out with a book every now and again as someone that was almost completely forgotten, and they found some good record. And so I mean, there's sometimes we don't even know what we don't know. I mean, sometimes we know what we don't know. We know that there was someone there, and we know what's information. But sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. I mean, there's things that are truly forgotten. And one of the reasons that we do what we do is to try to take what's almost forgotten and keep it from taking that last step into we don't remember it anymore.
And it's, I mean, this story is such a good example of that, because even the Baltimore plot, which, if it was a real thing, which a lot of people argue it wasn't, but it's really hard to know. I mean, Pinkerton certainly claimed to have some incredible evidence of it, but it's Pinkerton, so I don't know if he was making some of that stuff up in his books, or kind of exaggerating what it was. But it was at least important enough that, I mean, they convinced Lincoln to do something that he did not really want to do.
Yeah, and Lincoln actually took some political heat for that. And so, I mean, that's an interesting bit. I mean, you can see some of that reverberating in politics today, too. I mean, once you decide you don't like someone, then you can turn anything into a reason to attack. So, I mean, no one would think twice, though, about the Secret Service taking steps to protect from even a vague plot today. But at the time, it was kind of unheard of. No one would have thought of it. And so, that makes an extraordinary story in itself.
Yeah.
And how far that plot really went. I mean, there was a plot, but I mean, whether the plot had carried to the point where they were actually going to act that day, I mean, that's a real question. But I mean, if they had failed and he had been killed, we would remember it.
Oh yeah, it would. I mean, it just absolutely.
Or if they had succeeded because someone jumped in front of the person with the gun or something like that. But if you succeed the way that they did it, then you wouldn't know that you succeeded. You wouldn't know what you prevented because you kept it from happening.
Yeah, and I mean, that really could be. I mean, it could have been a very important piece of history in terms of if there really was that plot. And it's just impossible to know at this point how serious that plot was. I mean, there could have been people on the street who were considering it.
Yeah, we don't know. But I mean, she played an interesting role in that interesting piece of it's. I mean, even at the time, we don't know it. So I mean, when you talk about forgotten history, I mean, it wasn't even clear what happened then.
No, and they for years they have suggested that it wasn't as big, but even Ward Hill Layman, the bodyguard, didn't think there was anything to do with that. But I don't know. It's just hard to know about exactly how serious it was, and if there were people in that crowd that day who were disappointed that they didn't see Lincoln, not because they wanted to see a president, but because they were hoping to
they were hoping to kill
him. Certainly the mood in the country was at a point where, I mean, they could an assassination plot would not have totally shocked anybody. Historian, right? I mean, it was a point where people were, I mean, tensions were high, but I don't know exactly. It's just hard to know. I do know, the Pinkerton agency has a complex legacy. A lot of the prestige that they had gained, even under Alan Pinkerton, he dies in 1884. They lost a lot of that with unpopular actions against unions. And there's some evidence that Alan himself was not terribly pro-union, but the stuff that really hurt them happened all after his death, and after the women detectives were all disbanded. And I don't know if they would have made any difference, in terms of how that stuff happened if they had still had women detectives. But I did think it's an interesting way to talk about, what do you think about those kinds of historical contradictions, of which there are plenty of places where there are men who did incredible things, who also did maybe less incredible things.
It's part of the nature. I mean, there's nobody's perfect, and every story is going to have two different sides to it. But I mean, they were also what they were doing. I mean, it was a complex time. And so it's easy to see heroes and villains in either side. And I mean, there's a lot of different, I mean, they were aggressive in how they tried to enforce the law, and that, that creates, disdain. But on the other hand, I mean, they were sometimes dealing with, bad people.
True.
I mean, I think first of all, any business is going to. I mean, they were taking business, right?
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily breaking the law at the time, but they were taking business. And any business is able to run afoul, at least of public opinion, because you do what you have to do in order to keep a profitable business. And it's easy when you're doing a profitable business also to step across lines or to lose whole vision of those lines. And so there's a lot of I mean it happens, I think, in law enforcement, but I mean there's everywhere you look in history, you're going to find that everywhere there's a hero, there's going to be something behind that hero that makes you wonder, how did you? Yeah, and that's maybe part of how you rise to power. So I mean, when you talk about those contradictions, I think part of it is kind of the nature of someone that's noteworthy. That part of becoming noteworthy, it means that you're going to be walking in places where people at least are able to question some of what you do.
Yeah.
And part of it is in just the ambiguous nature of life. I mean, if how far is it too far to go when you're trying to track down someone who's, legitimately breaking the law? And or how much rights does a mine owner have to defend their interests?
Yeah.
So we try not to take sides in history, and we try to present an unvarnished version that shows how you see things from both sides. And I think if things didn't have both sides, our stories wouldn't be nearly as interesting.
Yeah.
But I mean, I have trouble going back and I think you would certainly say that the Pinkertons did good. But I think you would also would be able to look at some cases and say, maybe the Pinkertons were very much stepping over lines at various times.
It's an interesting thing that I think we see a lot of talk about is, whether we should learn, whether certain pieces of history should be remembered, because if the Pinkertons are, bad guys, maybe we don't want to remember any piece of them. But it is, and I think, part of our vision is that it is all history. And that it really isn't, I mean, it just never is as black and white as we want it to be.
They were pioneers in an industry that hadn't been created. And so how do you even know where the lines were? I mean, a lot of the time they were the ones that were kind of helping to make that determination. They certainly played important roles in important chunks of history. I can't judge on any specific instance because that's not my job as a historian. All I can do is tell the story. And I think that most of us understand that if someone were to tell your story, that there probably would be parts of the story that would leave people thinking, less of you, and parts that would leave them thinking more of you. And I mean, that's what it is to be human.
Yeah, that's just true on a larger collective sense for humanity.
But we honestly don't know if the agency would have been different if Alan Pinkerton had lived longer, or we don't know.
No, and it's hard because once we're in the position where we're at, where we can look back and we can judge these decisions and stuff like that. I'm not necessarily saying we shouldn't make some judgments. We is the kind of the universal we as on pieces of history, but also you can't change it once it's happened. And for us as historians, telling the story I think is as important as.
Absolutely, I certainly am not saying that you shouldn't judge.
Yeah.
Even though you could caution against some too much anachronism in your judgment. What I'm saying is the historian shouldn't judge. The historian should tell the story and leave it to others to judge the story. That's my vision of history. That's not everybody's vision of history. That's not how some historians work. No. But I mean that's my idea. My goal is to tell the history. And to leave the judgment to other people, because history is what informs you, and then you make your decisions from there. So, if we're providing the premise that allows you to come to deductive reasoning, that's fine. And if two different people come to different conclusions, that's fine. But you have to have a basis of fact to do that, and that's what we're trying to do, is to as much as we can present that basis of fact. And that's why you can talk about someone like Alan Pinkerton or everything that the agency did, and give it the whole context, and then let people judge however they want to judge what that means today.
I agree. I think that's where our vision is, and I really, that's, for me, I'm proud that that's kind of the history that we tell. Is we're not trying to sugarcoat anything. We're not trying to make villains or heroes out of people. We're just trying to tell the story as it happened. And that does make me think of this story and other stories that we've talked about making movies. I think that Kate Warne, we don't necessarily know enough about her specifically to make, films, but it makes me think that there's some stuff in here that could inspire some very cool movies.
She could be a great heroine.
Yeah.
I think there was a Canadian TV series sometime in the mid 2000s that was about the Pinkertons. I think she had a character in there.
Yeah.
But it would be quite interesting to have mystery in the West and have her as a protagonist.
Yeah.
I think that could be. And some of the stories, I think that television series was really actually basing on Pinkerton's book and was supported by the agency, and they were actually telling true stories of the agency. But I mean, there could be actually some good fiction written out of this heroine as a character too.
And she was doing so much, and so many. We don't know much at all about what she was doing, during the actual Civil War. We know that Pinkerton acted in support of the military, but we don't really know much about what her actions were specifically there.
Yeah, I think there could be certainly something here, and it's another one of those. We're always saying that the story of history is actually more interesting than a lot of what is done in fiction, and this is an example of that. And this is an example of an actual true character that could be a really fascinating character to, because what are her motivations to do what she was doing at the time that she was doing it, and how much risk did she take, and why was she willing to take on that personal risk? I think there's a really interesting story there. So I agree. I mean, it was a good story to tell on the History Guy, and I think it would be a good story for someone to tell if they wanted to tell it on the big screen.
I really agree. I hope to see something like that someday. Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately. And so what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
This morning I was watching something called Shoreline Detectives, which is a series about the United Kingdom. It's got so much history. And so they just take a piece of shoreline, and anywhere you find a shoreline in the UK, you're going to find lots of history. And they were looking, like one of them was looking at an 18th century shipwreck. Another one was looking at some medieval ruins, as well as up to 19th century lime kilns. It's an archaeology story, an interest in archaeology. Archaeology along the shoreline is always particularly interesting because the ocean tends to wear away history, and you have to go down and really dig in to find it. And that's particularly interesting to me in the UK, where there's just such a length of history, where you can stumble on things from pre-Roman times up to Napoleonic times that are all quite interesting. There's, I think, 9 different episodes in the series, and it's really fascinating because it says wherever little chunk of coast of England you go, you're going to find a lot of very interesting history. And one of the many things I love about Magellan TV is that you can see something about almost anything that if you want to see nature, if you want to see history, if you want to see whatever. And what have you been watching lately on Magellan TV?
So one of the things I was watching this week was I've been really interested in. We finally got the James Webb Space Telescope up, and so I watched this fairly short little documentary, about a half hour, that was talking about. It's called Planet Hunting with the James Webb Space Telescope. And to be honest, it's kind of a primer for what we will hopefully be looking at when the James Webb Telescope starts, bringing us information. Because I think there's a lot of stuff out there still to discover that we haven't even touched on. And the James Webb Space Telescope is going to be able to see some stuff that we haven't been able to see. It's also going to be able to look at some of the stuff that we have found. And that's kind of what they talk about in this, is they talk about how the James Webb Telescope is going to be able to help us kind of look further back into the past using more sensitive infrared. I think it's looking forward to hopefully some truly incredible discoveries, and kind of how we might be able to tell when we see these exoplanets. I mean, is there life there, and how would we find that out? And the James Webb is supposed to be more sensitive to some of that stuff. Hopefully, I mean, we might be seeing some really, really cool stuff in the next decade or so in space exploration.
That's amazing. I love watching space stuff on Magellan. I really do. For a historian, first of all, this is as cutting edge future as you can get. But it's allowing us literally to look back in time. Yeah. And there's such a great history of human space exploration and how we came to where we are and why we're always trying to do that. And what in human nature, I mean, the same thing that got people in a boat and asked them to sail, across an unknown ocean. It's an interesting piece of technology. Like anything else happening today, in 20 years, what are we going to come back and say about the Webb Space Telescope? And what does it really mean to us? And because we don't know yet what it's going to change. And that's just so exciting. It will be fun history at some point.
And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you. Sometimes a free month, or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Next up, The History Guy talks about Big Nose Kate, the common-law wife of Doc Holliday. And stay tuned after the episode to hear us chat a little more with the History Guy.
Virgil Morgan and Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday walked into history on October 26, 1881, when they exchanged gunfire with a group of outlaws in the town of Tombstone in the Arizona Territory. What happened there is fairly well known, but much less well known was the story of the woman who briefly accompanied Doc Holliday at his time there in Tombstone and who may have saved his life earlier in his career. Without her, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday may not have walked side by side into the most famous gunfight in the history of the Wild West. Mary Catherine Horney, better known as Big Nose Kate, was another larger-than-life, colorful character of the Wild West, and hers is a story that deserves to be remembered. Her entire history is shadowy and may be full of tall tales. Some historians say Kate was born in Hungary, Slovakia in November 1849. Others claim the year was 1850. Kate was one of several children. One story surrounding her family's immigration to Mexico says that her father, Michael Horny, was a personal physician to Maximilian I, the Austro-Hungarian Archduke, whom Napoleon III had installed as the Emperor of Mexico. And when the monarch's reign failed, Horny moved his family to Iowa. There is little evidence to support that claim. Other historians say the family immigrated through New York City, like many others in that era, and wandered west, eventually settling in Iowa. Whatever the truth, Kate's parents died when she was a teenager at 14 or 15 and left her and her siblings without parents in Iowa. Unhappy with her situation, she ran away from the foster home that took her in and stowed away on a riverboat that was traveling down the Mississippi. In later memoirs, Kate claims that she was discovered by the riverboat captain on this trip and was taken under his wing. She began to use his last name, Kate Fisher, and enrolled in a school at a convent in St. Louis. Historians disagree over whether she graduated from the school, but her contemporaries say that she was smart enough to be successful at whatever she chose to do, although opportunities were somewhat limited for women at the time. She claims that in St. Louis she married a man named Silas Melvin and had a child with him, but both he and the child died of an illness. But again, the historical record is unable to prove that claim. But it also appears to be in St. Louis where she first began working as a prostitute. It was there, some historians claim, that Kate first met a man named John Henry Holliday, who would go on to fame in the West with the moniker Doc Holliday. Holliday had recently graduated from a dental school in Pennsylvania, but could not yet get a license to practice because he was too young, not yet 21 years of age. Holliday was in St. Louis because a friend, A. Jemison Fuchs Jr., offered Holliday a job in his practice in the interim. Fuchs' office was only a few blocks away from where Kate was plying her trade. Holliday, with his Georgia drawl and legendary manners, was probably quite memorable to Kate among the other men she entertained. He returned to Georgia in 1872 to open his own dental practice, leaving her behind, plying her trade. After this, historians believe Kate was working as a prostitute in Dodge City, Kansas. We know Kate changed locations because there is documentation showing she was fined in Dodge City for being a sporting woman, which was what officials called prostitution at the time. She was working at a brothel owned by Nellie Earp, the wife of James Earp, who was one of the lesser-known Earp brothers. Throughout her busy life, Kate was known by many nicknames because of her marriages and reputation of moving from place to place. In addition to Big Nose, she was also known as Katie Elder, Mrs. John H. Doc Holliday, Nosy Kate, Kate Cummings, and Kate Melvin. The nickname Big Nose Kate was actually used by Wyatt Earp in an article he wrote for a San Francisco newspaper in 1896. Earp wrote that this wasn't a comment on her actual nose, but referred to her strong, bold character. He said she had a legendary temper and valued her freedom over most anything else. Despite numerous film depictions to the contrary, Kate wasn't particularly fond of Earp, and the feeling was reciprocated. She was not a blushing violet, and never apologetic for her profession or her hard-drinking ways. The men around Kate may not have appreciated the way she didn't ask for permission to live the way she wanted to. They may also have been intimidated by her intelligence, which Holliday was known to have said was equal to his own. In the 1870s, Kate was living with J.S. Elder, a saloon keeper in Wichita, who gave her the surname made famous in the 1965 Western film The Sons of Katie Elder, starring John Wayne and Dean Martin. She was arrested for prostitution in June of that year, and that brush with the law may have encouraged her to move somewhere more friendly to her profession. Kate went upstream from Dodge City to Great Bend, and her protector, J.S. Elder, went elsewhere. Unfortunately, trouble found her again in Great Bend, and Kate was fined $10 for assault and battery. She found another man to protect her, a saloon owner, gambler, and gunslinger named Tom Sherman, a man with a fearsome reputation. Sherman wasn't someone to mess around with. According to one story, after shooting a man in a gunfight, Sherman said to the people watching, "I'd better shoot him again, hadn't I, boys?" And he did, walking up to point-blank range to do so. Kate and Sherman wandered the West, going from town to town seeking opportunities for both prostitute and gambler. She was working in Fort Griffith, Texas, when Doc Holliday blew into her life again. In the time since she had known him in St. Louis, Holliday had been shot in the leg and now walked with a limp. He had also picked up what people at the time called lung disease or consumption. Doctors today call it tuberculosis. It would eventually kill him, but in the meantime, Holliday went west, seeking the drier climates that were believed to help those with his condition. Along the way, he was developing his own reputation for violence, and no patience for those he felt were shortchanging him. In addition to reuniting with Kate, it was at Fort Griffin that Holliday met Wyatt Earp, then a deputy U.S. Marshal, who was on the trail of the notorious outlaw, Dirty Dave Rudabaugh. Holliday had played cards with Rudabaugh and described him as an ignorant scoundrel. It is entirely possible that Wyatt and Doc Holliday were introduced by Kate, who was probably already familiar with Earp, having worked at James Earp's saloon earlier in her career. Later, Earp told a story about what happened in Fort Griffin, which Kate said he embellished, but which actually showed her in a good light. According to Earp, Holliday was playing cards with a notorious gambler named Ed Bailey when things went awry. Bailey, apparently not trusting Holliday to play fairly, was looking through the discard pile after every hand. That was blatantly against the rules of the card game. Holliday asked Bailey to stop, and when he didn't, Holliday raked in the pot, apparently intending to leave. Bailey drew his gun to make Holliday put the money back, but Holliday gutted Bailey with a knife, killing him. The townspeople nabbed Holliday and threw him in jail, rumbling about ropes and murder. Kate jumped to Holliday's rescue by setting a huge fire to attract the town's attention, and then showed up at the jail, toting a gun in both hands, demanding Holliday's release. However the jailbreak happened, Kate and Holliday fled town and were at Dodge City, Kansas, shortly thereafter. She claims that they married some time before arriving in Dodge City, and they registered at the hotel there under the name Dr. and Mrs. Holliday. But like so many things in Katie's life, there's no evidence to prove that it actually happened. The registration might have been an attempt to lend some legitimacy to their situation. Now together, Holliday continued to work as both a dentist and a gambler, while Kate continued to practice the world's oldest profession. They continued on westward after Holliday was accused of burglarizing a store in Dodge City. His cough was becoming worse. They weren't tied down to any one place for very long. Holliday established a saloon in Las Vegas, New Mexico territory, but the town was already garnering a reputation for violence, so he sold up and the couple moved on. When the Earps encouraged Holliday to move to Tombstone, a rustic silver mining camp in Arizona territory, Kate lived elsewhere for a time, but joined him before the big shootout for which he is most well remembered. By some accounts, she may have witnessed the shootout. Their relationship throughout their time together was tempestuous. Once, after a serious argument, Holliday's enemies took advantage of their estrangement and talked Kate into filing a false claim with authorities that Holliday had helped to rob the Benson stagecoach. She'd been very drunk at the time that she made the statement, but it was a very serious accusation. 2 men had been killed in the holdup. The Earps stepped in and provided witnesses, proving Kate's statement false, but the damage to Kate and Holliday's relationship seemed permanent. They were never as close after that time. Things deteriorated further after Town Marshal Virgil Earp arrested Kate for disorderly conduct, and she left town, furious. Holliday died in Colorado in 1887. Kate married again in 1890 to George Cummings, a miner and, according to Kate, abusive alcoholic. They moved to Bisbee, Arizona, and Kate opened a bakery that failed. She divorced Cummings and moved in with Jack Howard, another miner. This final relationship seemed to be a good fit, as Kate put down roots and stayed with Howard for 30 years. Howard left her the home they lived in after his death in 1930. Aging and short of resources, Kate sold the home and applied to Arizona Governor George Hunt for permission to move into the Arizona Pioneers' home in Prescott. The home had originally been established for aging and infirm men who settled the western frontier. They were also required to be American citizens, which Kate may or may not have been. It took her some time, but she was eventually given permission to move into the home. Kate was the first woman who was granted permission to do so. In her final years, she maintained active letter-writing campaigns to political leaders in an effort to improve the lot of those who lived in the Arizona Pioneers' home. She remained feisty and outspoken to the end, died of heart disease in November of 1940. She's buried at the cemetery at the Arizona Pioneers' home in Prescott, Arizona. While she was at the Arizona Pioneers' home, several authors came to her offering to write her story. At first she was angry because they didn't offer her money, and then she was angry because the story never seemed to get written. But those conversations did tell us something about her relationship with Doc Holliday. She said of him, "I loved Doc, thought the world of him, and he was always kind to me until he got mixed up with those Earps." One wonders what nickname Big Nose Kate used when she was referring to Wyatt Earp. She said of her life once, "Part is funny, part is sad. Such is life any way you take it." Very reminiscent of a quote about life that Doc Holliday gave when he said, "There is no normal life. There is only life." And that famous couple represented life in the Wild West.
So, though they existed in very different worlds, both of these women, both named Kate, were active around the same time, and both of them ended up contributing, I mean, significantly to American history, and I think playing a part that, even if it has been largely forgotten, is worth remembering.
Yeah, you got to wonder if they bumped into each other, would they have liked each other? Would they have hated each other? I honestly don't know.
That's a good question, because they were both big personalities, and I mean, I think with Big Nose Kate, what an impact on like cultural memory, and not just at the time, but today with all the movies and stuff that have been made of it. What that impact of that shootout in Tombstone. It's incredible to think that, that she played such a role in that, and that the complexities of what it took to make that event, which is so iconic, happen.
It does. I mean, she says, I mean, her, being behind Doc Holliday, it really says a lot about, I mean, when we focus a lot on the gunfights and the stuff that we've seen in Western movies, you miss what was life really like, what was culture really like in the West. And I think that she adds that huge depth to it to understand that, and that it wasn't just roaming cowboys, that people had lives, that they were trying to live lives that we would think of as normal lives today, and including love and including family, and so it's really interesting to add that to the characters. I mean, because otherwise they're not, they're two-dimensional. They're dime novel characters. And when you start to understand who they were as people is when you start to understand things like who they loved and how who they loved impacted them. And she's interesting. She's Enigma too, though. I mean, most of the pictures that we have of Big Nose Kate, we're not sure that that's actually her. As a matter of fact, it's not even really clear if she was called Big Nose Kate because her nose was actually big, or if because she was a nosy person. And we've gotten both stories there. We are dealing with a bit of a fuzzy storyline behind but you start to see really the personality that comes out behind that, and then how that personality was part of these other big, better known personalities from the time.
Well, and it's amazing to think, she played a very important role with some figures that are really well remembered in American history, but there are so many characters like her that existed around all of those people, and we're also just trying to live their lives. I mean, we don't talk about it a lot, but every single day, we've got to come up with what we're going to eat, and we've got to know how we're going to pay our bills and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, everyone else through history was worrying about that stuff too.
Was worrying about and doing it in different contexts when you had to do different things in order to be able to do that. Yeah. So I mean, again, it takes it from the movie to these were real people living real lives, and living them as best they could in the situations that they could.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that Big Nose Kate, ultimately, her story is a good example of that saying, behind every great man is a great woman. And while she wasn't behind Doc Holliday the whole time, she was an incredible personality who clearly played an important role in his life. And I think it's really amazing to think,
Again, it's hard to say if you would want to call either of them great.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they were both
That's also a fair point.
With real foibles, yes, yeah. But it's interesting how, I mean, everything that makes him such a fascinating character, you can absolutely see in her, and you can see how they must have been quite a pair.
And how they were attracted to each other and connected to each other. It's interesting too to see all of the various personalities, and she wasn't really a fan of Wyatt Earp, and vice versa. And it's all those kind of characters that they were all living regular. They weren't all just superheroes. I mean, which I think is what we get in a lot of those Western movies, is that these were gunslinging people who were heroes and had those, and even if they had foibles or whatever, they still had these hugely important moral compasses or whatever we were looking at in those. And the truth is that all of them were facing life in a very chaotic world.
It was. Yeah, and a world of so much change.
Yeah.
One of the things that when you really get to know, I mean, for all that we talk about in movies and things like that, what you really see when you look at the life of Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp is two guys who, over their lifetime, the world changed so much. I mean, what they did to make a living when they were in their 30s was no longer even acceptable behavior by the time they were in their 50s. And they had to figure out how to keep living in that. And to see that period of change, that weird overlap between the frontier and the modern world, and between the whole change of sensibilities, which is, what was Big Nose Kate a respectable woman? I mean, that depends on the era that you're talking about, and she crossed over those eras, and so people would judge her very differently.
Yeah.
So I mean, it is a fascinating time to look at, not just because of the exciting part of the Wild West, but because this was kind of the end of that frontier, and the new world was kind of moving in on that, and you see how that caught people in the middle who had lived in one world and were then essentially thrust into the next.
And they didn't have anywhere to go. When that frontier starts to close, I mean, there comes a point where the way that they could kind of exist as
I mean that affected both of them.
Yeah.
Of course, Bat Masterson, who was one of Wyatt Earp's deputies in Dodge, ended up a baseball sports writer. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a very it's astounding to think of how that change occurred.
Yeah, that those two things could be within just a few decades. I mean, we've seen a lot of change,
Yes.
in our own lives
in the same
but-
career.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
To go
we
from
think we've seen change because our cell phones got thinner, and to understand how much things changed in that period at the end of the 19th century, in terms of technology and culture and society. I mean, worldwide, but especially in the United States too, where parts of the United States were still just being populated, and parts of the United States were as urbane as any place in the world.
Yeah, that shift between, say, 1860 and 1890, that period, where whole sections, I mean, there were states, when Wyoming was first, they organized the territorial government in the 1869, and there were like 5,000 people in the whole state. And then by 1890, I mean, there were over 60,000 in Wyoming, and Wyoming is still the least populated state. But all these other places went from being places where there was literally no one, and you were building a house with your own hands, to, I mean, honestly, the mail order catalogs got to a point where you could order stuff that could not possibly have been carried over by your parents to the same location.
Yep.
And it's incredible how much that changed. And I think this is an interesting way to look at it.
How much the railroad changed that, how much industrialization
Yeah.
changed that, how much the impacts of the Civil War changed that. And think about that change for the Native Americans.
Yeah.
Think about that change for African Americans. I mean, how much different was life between 1860 and 1890? If you were born black in the South in 1850, and you were still around in 1890, I mean, how much had the world changed?
Wow.
But also, if you were born in Ireland, and did you come across? And I mean, it was a period where I don't know that anybody could even really grasp what world they were still in, because it had changed so very dramatically. And one of the ways that you see that is in these Wild West heroes who seem to have a foot in two worlds. I mean, it's hard to imagine that we had people still out, slinging guns in the Wild West, if you go look, at what was going on in the East at the time. So it's really interesting to talk about the West. It really is, and it's interesting to talk about, what it took to go and try to populate a frontier, and how different social norms work, and what was acceptable were, and violence very much more common. And it is really an interesting time to talk about. And of course, it's been mythologized a lot through our popular culture, but it is truly, historically, a fascinating time to study, because it represents a time where we literally can see the movement from unpopulated wildland to frontier to city life, and you see that over just a few decades, where where suddenly these cities now look just like modern cities today. Yeah, and it's just kind of hard to imagine that shift over. Yeah,
I think it's just such an interesting thing to look at, and I think these people end up being good examples of what it was like to live through that, and to really go from a place where you could do the things, like you said, that what was acceptable behavior, what was just a reasonable thing to do in 1860 was suddenly a completely unacceptable or a completely out of place thing to do in 1890, and it's amazing. And
in 1890, and that's what you learned to do for that. You couldn't gamble for a living anymore. It was no longer respectable. And that's how both of them made their money for a very long period of time, and that's what they would always rely on if something fell through. And suddenly that's gone. Were they heroes or were they villains? They came from a time when people danced those lines all the time.
Oh yeah.
And when the line before someone who's just a cowboy that's herding cattle, a cowpoke, and then the next season they maybe are a rustler, and it's in between someone who many of the people that enforce the law were certainly criminals before, some of the people that arrested bank robbers had robbed banks, and so it's a time when that wasn't all that uncommon. And it wasn't all that uncommon to have a relationship like Doc Holliday and Big Nose Kate did, where they were maybe never married, where she was maybe married to somebody else, where their relationship kind of wandered in and wandered out, and that was not uncommon.
It just was a chaotic time, And it's a time that I think it's
and
so different
it
from
makes
what
for this
we've...
interesting story that's probably
Yeah.
truly a love story. I mean, in the way that they stayed
Yeah.
together for the period that they did. So, I mean, I think that's one of the
Despite
reasons why
everything.
people have enjoyed it in popular culture. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was fun to tell as the story for the history guy.
And I kind of think that, both of these women must have been just an incredible force of personality. Both of them, although they ended up living such different lives, I mean, they faced the world and they refused to let it tell them how they were going to live their lives. And
But I mean, they both also took risks.
That's also true.
Risks with their lives that women weren't expected to
Yeah.
take. That probably said a lot about them. I think you had to be an incredibly brave woman for your name to even carry through from the period.
Yeah, right.
And both of their name, these two Kates did, and and you find that in you find that, I mean, like, later in life, Big Nose Kate is arguing for the people that are in the Arizona Pioneers home, and I mean, it's clear that she stayed a powerful personality to the end of her days.
Yeah, she was never going to put up with something just because. And that's, I mean, it's an amazing thing, and it's amazing to know that these people have always existed and have always been willing to fight for whatever it is they wanted to do. And sometimes, I mean, there were always obstacles, but both of them, and they both had their share of setbacks. But ultimately, they lived a life, and it's incredible for us to look back and see just what it must have taken for them to live the life that they lived. One other thing I wanted to ask, and it's a little more personal, but I know that you and I write stories about all kinds of different history. But I wanted to ask you, do you have a special interest in Western history?
I mean, of course, because I'm American. I grew up in the United States. I mean, I don't know if it's as interesting, somewhere else, because this is just something as quintessentially American history as you can get. And yeah, I grew up, I think I've said lots of times that one of the reasons where I developed my love of history is that my dad was always watching John Wayne movies. And that's part of how I got interested in history. And of course, John Wayne made a whole lot of Westerns. So I think so. I mean, I think that there's, that I find a fascination, but I think it's a fairly common fascination in America because that's just this interesting part of our history that in many ways Americans still kind of define ourselves as the Wild West. Right. And that affects a number of things that are kind of different about how America sees the world than a lot of our peers do. And it's from a history standpoint, it's not only that it's interesting history and interesting personalities and good stories, but it also says a lot about how we identify ourselves as Americans.
I mean, that frontier attitude that we're going to go to these places that are difficult to survive in, and we're going to carve out whatever life we can make out of it. I mean, those are...
Yeah, well, but also the rugged individualism, I think a lot of the world sees us as relatively anarchist, not thinking that we need as much government. Well, that's because we have this relatively recent period that we still remember where people moved beyond government and they had to be, their own version of the law. And that, I think, still is part of how people judge Americans today, that, Americans see that because that's how we remember, building the nation that we have.
It's a central piece to that kind of American mythology of what makes America America.
It is, and it defines so much of who we are as a people, and both in terms of our crimes and our virtues of the past too. And so it's hard to say. I mean, what would have it been like if we hadn't moved west, if we had just chosen not to go challenge the Great Plains? That's an interesting counterfactual, but I mean, we did, and it became a big part of who we are. And there's still people in America who are living on the land that their ancestors, came and put 4 stakes around and improved that land under the Homestead Acts, and turned it into the modern nation that it is today.
Yeah, and
that attitude kind of carries along.
And that comes with, I mean, there are lots of places where you can criticize America in that period as well. But it's one of those things that even if you do criticize it, it's a deeply integral part of that tapestry of American history, and it's something that you have to talk about and you have to face. And I mean, ultimately, these were all people who contributed to the America and the world that we know today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can see. I mean, again, it's. I don't mean to make any judgment on it. You can say a lot of things about the American expansion in the West, but you certainly can say that it was an exciting time that was full of stories that are worth telling.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.